I'm trying to educate myself in Italian. I have a Babel course on my telephone, but I don't feel secure enough to present in Italian this afternoon. So I'm glad that there are interpreters here to give me some support. I'm an attorney in Amsterdam, and I'm what they call nowadays a public interest litigator, and I've been doing that since the beginning of the 80s of the former century. Since halfway the 80s, I'm also doing environmental cases quite a bit. And my first air quality case was in the beginning of, that was not that long ago, the beginning of this century. I think I have also only 15 minutes, so I will give you just an overview of the cases related to our topic today that I've been dealing with. Those were a variety of cases before a variety of different courts, administrative law courts, as well as civil law courts, also the European Union courts. And in it, obviously, all those sections of the law are being applied, with the exception of international human rights law, which I usually try to include in litigation as well. There's one constant factor in my air quality cases, and that's Milieudefensie, which is a Dutch environmental organization, I think one of the oldest ones in the Netherlands, who is always the lead plaintiff in these cases. Of course, we had several directives which together made up the framework for the air quality issues, and under those the former directives, I did one case in The Hague, and I was happy to be able to rely on the Janecek case, which I usually do in this type of cases, because it always comes back one way or the other. And there's always new judges who you have to explain to that the citizens have rights, and that they have rights to demand at least a plan which is in accordance with the European directive. The first case was a case before the court in The Hague on behalf of Milieudefensie and several local groups of citizens that lived on the dirtiest street of the Netherlands. The air pollution was so bad, the traffic was so bad that the emissions were the highest from the Netherlands. And we demanded in that case that the court would instruct the city authorities to take decisions in order to keep the traffic out of the streets, or to take measures that would lead to a similar sort of result. At that point in time, I think this was probably 15 years ago or so, 10 years ago, the court said, well, it's a margin, there is a huge margin of appreciation for city authorities when it comes to this type of decisions. And the city had defended itself by saying, yes, we're working on it. And the judge said, well, you hear that they're working on it, so that's enough. And that nowadays seems to be a bit old-fashioned, given the developments in the case law, but that was the regular way that courts would deal with cases like this. And they were supported by rulings of the highest administrative court in the Netherlands, the Council of State. Then work started in the same time in Brussels on the renewal of the entire air quality legislation. And the Dutch government was extremely active in that period of time before the legislation was adopted. They were very much present at the table where these issues were discussed, and they said, raise the limit values. And that was quite something to say, because the limit values were already established in a directive of 1998, including the dates on which they were to be respected. But the Dutch government said, that's too much of a problem, we don't want to do that. Raise the limit values. They were not successful with that. They also argued postpone the dates, postpone the time limit dates, the limits for it's two limits. It's a time limit for the limit values, and they needed to be postponed according to the government. That was not successful either. But then they invented the derogation system, and there the Dutch government was successful, and that's how we got Article 22 of the directive. And of course, the Dutch were the first member state to apply for the derogation mechanism. I'm not going to be dealing in detail because that's a story in itself, but Milieudefensie discussed this issue with me, and we thought it would be a good idea to try to litigate this matter immediately on the European level, because the procedure is that the government notifies the European Commission of the fact that they want to have more time to realize the limit values. After the Commission gave its permission, we decided to try out actually the regulation, which is called the Aarhus regulation, although it does not really do what the Aarhus Convention would expect. But we did try the regulation 1367 of 2006, which is the internal review procedure. So we asked the European Commission with loads of arguments to review its positive response to the notification of the Dutch, basically stating that the plan that the Dutch had brought to Brussels in support of their request was full of fantasies, and half of them were already withdrawn at the time that we were going to the Commission to explain our the problems we had with the derogation. The Commission responded in writing and declared our objections not admissible. We appealed that decision at the General Court, and the General Court agreed with us, which was quite something, and which we hoped would be our way to eternal glory and lead to a landmark decision of the Court of Justice. But the Court of Justice had a different opinion and came to the conclusion that the Commission was correct in declaring our objections not admissible. It's a story in itself, very interesting, but not for the topic of today. So the Dutch got their derogation, and the government enjoyed the higher limit values, and the population obviously got to enjoy that same thing also. The Minister of Infrastructure and Environment, which was a strange combination, and it doesn't function like that any longer, but at the time that was one ministry, used the extension of the time limit of the period for the limit values to raise the speed limits on the ring roads around Amsterdam and Rotterdam. So it's to any regular, normal person that is crazy, because they had asked for the derogation because they weren't able to meet the limits, and then they got it, and then they used it to raise the speed limits, which is a difference of 25% of emissions. So that was quite something, but the minister got away with it in Parliament. But we brought the issue before two courts, the court in Rotterdam, because it related to the highway around Rotterdam, and the other one to the district court in Amsterdam. And the court in Rotterdam turned out to be completely in agreement with our position, and referred explicitly to health damage. And if the court said if health damage is at stake, you need to be particularly careful with a decision like this, especially because, and that was established, at that point in time, the air quality around Rotterdam was above the 40 milligrams per cubic meter as far as NO2 is concerned. So the district court did also agree that here an issue of human rights law was at stake, especially Articles 3 and 8 of the European Human Rights Convention. And the court also agreed that in this context, the precautionary principle should have its meaning, and to be short, it quashed the decision of the minister and instructed the minister to come up with a decision which would indeed fit within the reasoning of the court. The district court in Amsterdam, a couple of months after that, came to the same conclusion, and also said that that was important that the court stated this, because the minister had defended her decision in Parliament by saying, we got room until up to 60 milligrams emissions, and we may just fill that up all the way as long as we have that room. And of course, if in 5 years we need to go lower, then we'll probably have to lower the maximum speed limits again. But the court in Amsterdam said the the authorities are not at liberty in this particular situation at liberty to use the entire room up to the limit, which was too high from a non-formal point of view to begin with. So the new decision turned out to be impossible for the minister, and the only decision that she could come to was to turn around and bring the maximum speed to 80 kilometers again. Now, recently, and that's really close to our topic of today, Milieudefensie asked me to bring the state of the Netherlands to court because of the fact that the air quality in the Netherlands was within the limits on many places, but not altogether all over the country. While the directive is perfectly clear, the limit values need to be present everywhere. They need to be respected everywhere. And our reasoning was, as long as that is not the case, the state of the Netherlands is violating its obligations under the directive. In the Netherlands also, the overview of the air quality regulations is in the hands of the government in The Hague. And they have drawn up some sort of plan which they say one day this is an air quality plan, and the other day they say this is a plan specific for the Netherlands. But they are in charge of that plan, and therefore we decided to bring a case against the Dutch government with regard to all situations in the Netherlands where the limit values were not respected. We have also considered to go to the administrative courts, but the Council of State had already, in an unrelated issue, decided that the plan that the government had made, which is the sort of the umbrella above its entire policy on air quality, is not a decision in the administrative law sense. In other words, you cannot appeal that plan, you cannot ask for a withdrawal of the plan, and therefore we went to the civil law courts. Milieudefensie said, well, if we go to court, we want to go all the way, because in many areas in the Netherlands, the limit values are respected, but we don't agree that that leads to a healthy environment. And as we all know, the WHO has long ago, in 2005, published a very thorough researched paper and advice stating that at least the NO2 limits need to be cut in half, and the PM10 limits, they were sort of in agreement with the level that the EU had decided on. But Milieudefensie wanted to have a ruling of the court that the European maximum amounts are not safeguarding the health of the people, and therefore we wanted to go further than the European rules. So we could not just say the European rules are violated. That certainly, I'll talk about that in a minute, is part of the case, but we based our case on general tort law, stating that the government, who is in charge of caring for the health of its citizens, needs to take into account what scientific reports are telling us, and if you don't do that, that's a tort against your own citizens. So we request declaratory judgments, and part of the what we ask is a request of injunctions also. Briefly, the demands in our case, because it's still pending, be it in appeal, so there have been things happening in between, but it's still pending. The first part is that we requested a declaratory judgment. One, a violation of all the relevant provisions from the European Human Rights Treaty, but also from the United Nations Human Rights Treaty and Article 12 of the UN ECOSOC Treaty. I chose to do so to make it wider than only the European Convention, because there are reasons to sometimes decide not to bring a case before the court in Strasbourg, one of them being that it takes very long, but also it could be better in certain cases to give it a try at the UN courts, the committees in Geneva. But the first part of the demands was based on the violation of the WHO criteria, violation which also was existing of not developing a concrete policy towards those limits. In the alternative, our demand was that we asked the declaratory to state that the government had violated the European limits, but we said the Netherlands, remember the minister who said we may fill it up until the 60 milligrams per cubic meter, that is still the position of the government, that if they're only so little beneath the limit value, then we're safe. Well, it is clear, and the agency who is doing all the calculations, the measurements, etc., and it's an agency of the government, but it is independent. RIVM is the abbreviation. That agency had suggested that if you want to be sure that you're going to be in line with the limits, you need to have a policy which aims lower than the maximum, because there may be all sorts of reasons. Well, this year it will be going just a little bit up or a little bit down, and that means that you will never get rid of the violations. So that was our example, and we said a good faith interpretation, that's important, a good faith interpretation of the duty of the state with respect to the health of the people is to aim for a level that is below the limit values that are in the directive. And the third, even more alternative demand was, if you don't agree on 1 and 2 with us, then at least declare that the government is violating the directive because it is not taking care that in all of the Netherlands the limit values are respected. So that's the most simple, clear-cut demand of the case. And then the second part of the demands are injunction-like demands, which are all linked to 1, 2, and 3. It's 4, 5, and 6. and we asked for an order to instruct the state to end the violations at stake within half a year, beginning within a half a year, or a time decided by the court. When we were sitting down to decide the case, we had also, as usually, to decide, is this going to be a regular court case or is it an injunction case, which is a case for urgent matters. At the time we decided we'll go for the regular case because at that point in time the court in The Hague was really on top of its work and would deliver judgments within a year or a year and a half, and we thought that would be acceptable. And we decided against an injunction case because usually judges don't like an injunction case if it's very complicated and technical. So we decided that this may be considered to be very complicated, and therefore we chose the regular case. But then, to our surprise, it took much longer for the court to proceed and to even set a date for the oral pleadings. And then I advised the clients to start an injunction case and not longer wait. And we had a much simpler approach. We had 3 requests. First, we want to have established that there is no true air quality plan in place in the Netherlands. So we asked for an order to immediately begin to work on a real air quality plan. The second part was that we wanted the court to tell the state of the Netherlands to, within 2 weeks, identify all the problems that we were still facing in the Netherlands with respecting the limit values. And then connected to that, after they did so, immediately begin with measures that are effectively bringing those violations to an end. And the third part was that we asked the court to order the state to refrain from any activities, factual activities as well as formal activities that would lead to continued or renewed violations of the limit values. The idea of that being that we don't want to come back to court every year. It's got to end someday. And I had included that because there's always, if you ask something like that, you have to think of a mechanism. Who is going to tell that they did a correct job or not? Who is going to tell that a previewed activity will be violating the limit values? And therefore I had included that the court would decide that the RIVM, this agency that I just mentioned, would have a decisive role in that. And it was a good choice to start the injunction case because this judge was almost 100% in agreement with our position, and it gave the injunction on all points except for the concrete measures that were to make. The secretary, the minister, the deputy minister, was, to our surprise, happy with the outcome because apparently she had problems within the ministry with this issue, and she announced the same day on TV that she was going to live up to this ruling entirely, and actually that's what she did. Only on the third part they have submitted an appeal, which was this order to prevent the state to take measures that would be a violation. In the meantime, the judgment or 2 months after that, the judgment in the real case was delivered by the court in The Hague. And that was, as I say here, a nightmare. It was the judgment was even longer than the pleadings of both parties together. And it was a total mess. Everything was mixed up. The difference between administrative law and civil law. And most of the plaintiffs, there were 2 environmental organizations and 80 citizens as plaintiffs, were declared inadmissible. They didn't have standing, that is. She also said, you should go to the administrative court with this business. And but then also the court, 3 judges, said milieudefensie may be admissible in all demands, so we will deal with those anyways. The court on our first demand, with respect to the WHO values, agreed that we had a possibility to ask for something like that, and also on the basis of the human rights provisions. But the attorney of the state had, or better, the deputy minister, immediately after we started the case, had informed the parliament, yes, we think WHO is very important, so we will do our best. And that's all they've ever said about it, but that's what the attorney of the state said in court, and the judges thought that would be enough. So that demand was rejected. The precautionary approach addition to the limit values was rejected as well, because the court said, you want us to change the law, and we're not doing that. Well, this was discussed during the hearings, obviously, and the idea is not to change the law, but to do something about the implementation of the law and the way it should be done. Rejected. The violation of the limit values, the court said yes to the first part of it, but then said there are 2 obligations for the state. One, to stay beneath the limit values, but if you don't succeed in doing that, then there is the Article 23 obligation, which tells the state to take measures to be in as short as possible period beneath the level. And the court said basically something to the extent that we are now in the area of Article 23, and now we have a margin of appreciation, and the state of the Netherlands has stayed within that margins. Then the final 3 were, because they're connected, also rejected. The injunction case, there was an appeal on one part of it, which we lost because the inclusion of a reference to the RIVM was not accepted by the Court of Appeal. But that really does not hurt the fact that still today the injunction case is being respected, the outcome, therefore. We're not at the end yet. The pleadings in this case will be in February. If you have any idea, please come. I wrote down many ideas already, but the more the better. Thank you very much.